This week we'd like to welcome back our anchor person, Teofilo Reyes. Welcome back, Tef. Alright, so let's start with some good news. Last week, Rigoberta Menchu, an indigenous woman from El Quiché, Guatemala, won the Nobel Prize for Peace. Rigoberta has struggled all her life to bring justice to Guatemala and has become a spokesperson for Native American rights across the continent. In the Nobel Committee's own words, today Rigoberta Menchu stands out as a vivid symbol of peace and reconciliation across ethnic, cultural, and social dividing lines in her own country, on the American continent, and in the world. The Guatemalan military denounced the decision, but the Guatemalan indigenous who bear the brunt of the Army's repression are still celebrating. We here at Dual are very happy with her candidacy. There could be no more fitting way to close this sad chapter that is the quincentenary. Over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff. On Sunday, October 18th, the Grand Rapids Press ran a short article with several moving photos of a Salvadoran girl recovering from gunshot wounds she suffered to her leg. The article is a classic piece of misinformation. In an article that is less than 50 lines, how can you expect to communicate the deep truth about the victims of USA-sponsored repression in a country still suffering from no peace? This is the article's first major flaw, because it gives the impression that things are fine since the signing of the peace accord between what the article calls the El Salvadoran conservative government and leftist rebels. In reality, the government they are referring to is the Arena government, long known to be behind the death squad and founded on Nazi principles. The leftist rebels they refer to as the FMLN, a coalition of military and civilian groups which enjoy popular support of the people and are founded on real democratic principles. The article says nothing about the recent attacks against human rights and union leaders such as Ivan Ramirez, Alejandro Perez, Roberto Anaya, all of which were murdered, as reported in the September issue of Peace Brigades International. The article also says nothing about how the Arena government is dragging its feet on some of the accords, as well as flatly refusing to implement other aspects of those same accords. But probably the greatest omission in the article is that it says nothing about the USA government and military involvement in the long-standing war in El Salvador, thus continuing to frame history with lies that leave children like Yanira with unmeasurable burdens. It also should be mentioned that this article appears in Sunday's Flair section, along with recipes for Halloween, conveniently stripping the article of any seriousness. I wonder why we don't find articles about Bosnia in the Flair section. Jeff?
Can't imagine why that is. Thanks, Jeff. Well, tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the blame game that's been going on within the corporate media, and that blame game has to do with the budget deficit. And if we could see the next graphic, you can see what I'm talking about. In his campaign speeches, George Bush perpetuates the myth that Congress is responsible for the $4 trillion federal deficit because it insists on passing huge budgets. But figures obtained from the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office reveal that there is little difference between the spending records of Presidents Reagan and Bush versus Congress. The years 1982 and 1993 are used on the chart because the former was Reagan's first budget and the latter is Bush's most recent one. The congressional figures come from the first budget resolution passed by Congress. Over the 12 years, 5 congressional budgets were lower than those recommended by the president. The difference between the totals amounts to a mere 0.05%. In the matter of the growth of the federal budget, the responsibilities are shared by the Republican presidents and the Democratic Congresses. But the primary responsibility must rest with the president. He initiates the process, and the final budget usually resembles his initial figures. Jeff?
Thanks, Jeff. Well, it's that time again. Time to decipher all that political babble, all that campaign caca, and all the rectum rhetoric that fills the pages of the corporate media faster than you can say defense expenditure. Here are tonight's words on this week's edition of Doublespeak Dictionary. Our first word tonight is deficit, and it means an excess of government expenditures over receipts, horrifying when liberal Democrats are in power, but only slightly troubling under right-wing Republican rule. Along with the urgency of defense expenditures, it provides the rationale for curbing outlays that serve special interests. Number 2, defense expenditures. Outlays which, no matter how large, speculative, or mismanaged, are rendered sacred by their nobility of purpose. Since there can never be too much national security, cavilling at a few $1 billion is obviously out of the question. Such cavilling is reserved for the boondoggle. Number 3, a boondoggle, which means a small welfare expense. now understood to extend at least as far as Mars. Number 5, diplomacy, restating to the enemy the terms of our ultimatum. And finally, number 6, credibility, the public's willingness to swallow official lies, and credibility usually means that it declines with the exposure of these lies, but recovers by virtue of the public's short memory. So that's it for Doublespeak Dictionary. Tune in again next week, and we'll have new words and their definitions. This is from Charlie Clements' book, Witness to War. Quote, "When we hear the sound of the helicopter, we know to run, because with the helicopter comes bullets, and then bombs, and then soldiers, rape, and death." Unquote. This comes from a Salvadoran woman who depicts the horror that many people in third world nations experience upon hearing the approaching helicopter. This week's corporate demon is Bell Helicopter, a subsidiary of Textron Company, the major supplier of military helicopters to the third world. With its world headquarters in Fort Worth, Texas, Bell has been a major factor in counterinsurgency warfare for the past 30 years. During the war in Southeast Asia, Bell became famous for its manufacture of H-Huey helicopters, known for its ability to maneuver quickly and to carry a forcible payload, meaning it can destroy with speed. Since the late 1970s, the USA government has contracted heavily with Bell to support its numerous wars in the Third World. Many Central American nations have been receiving Bell helicopters since 1979, numbering over 150 in the region. And according to a book by Jonathan Feldman, the Salvadoran military has been trained with Bell helicopters at Bell's international headquarters in Texas. If one is familiar with children's art from Central America, it usually depicts their scariest moments, like this picture of a Salvadoran refugee child's experience in 1981. You can see the helicopter terrorizing the village. It should also be mentioned that several members of its corporate directors of Bell are also major heads at universities such as North Carolina and Duke University, as well as the chairman of WNET-TV, Channel 13 in New York, and Paul Strick, who also sits on the board of the Council of Foreign Affairs. If you are a student of U of M or of MSU, Bell Helicopter may be of interest to you, since both universities have significant shares in Bell Helicopter stock. These relationships are clearly spelled out in Jonathan Feldman's book, Universities in the Business of Repression, a South End Press book that you can get here with Days of Our Lives staff. Thank you. Jeff?
Thank you, Jeff. And speaking of helicopters, we must speak again of helicopters, unfortunately. On Sunday, September 27th, the press printed an Associated Press article entitled, U.S. to Send Helicopters to Israel to Help Maintain, quote, military edge, unquote, about the Bush administration's plan to send an unspecified number of Apache and Black Hawk helicopters to Israel as part of the United States' commitment to maintaining Israel's, quote, qualitative military edge, unquote. The article reports that a, quote, certain amount of American-owned defense equipment will be located in Israel, unquote, according to an agreement between Bush and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. It went on to quote a White House announcement saying, quote, it was further agreed that there will be closer ties between the two countries' armed forces, cooperation on technology upgrades, and the start of discussions on Israel's participation in the global protection system, unquote. These initiatives represent a significant effort in reaffirming the United States' long-standing commitment to a strategic partnership with Israel, the White House spokesperson went on to say. Now, to begin with, Israel doesn't have a military edge in the Middle East. It's more like a military monopoly. Besides its massive conventional forces, which are constantly strengthened by nearly $4 billion a year in U.S. aid, it also has a nuclear arsenal that it denies the existence of. In addition, American-owned military equipment being placed in Israel is no new thing, as the article asserts. This shipment only adds to Israel's destructive capabilities. But the all-pervasive pro-Israeli bias of the corporate media is present in this article when you look at it from this way. Imagine an article in the Grand Rapids Press entitled, quote, U.S. to send helicopters to Iraq to help create military edge. Now, would this article merely contain statements of the White House spokespeople, like the Israeli article did, while ignoring past Iraqi military actions, as well as the protests from intellectuals and activists opposed to arming Iraq? You can bet that it wouldn't. That article would absolutely mention that only a few years ago, Iraq had demonstrated its belligerence by invading poor, helpless Kuwait and killing hundreds of people in the process. It would also definitely quote someone, perhaps perhaps unleash a reign of terror onto the Kurdish minority of northern Iraq. It's only logical that such an article would contain this extra background information. But, unfortunately, as always, logic is always a casualty when the corporate media deals with Israel. The U.S. is toady in the Middle East. The article does not mention that Israel has invaded far more territory and killed far more people than Iraq has. The occupation of Palestine, parts of Syria, the 1982 invasion of Lebanon, and the Air Force bombings of Tunisia never occurred as far as this article is concerned, although these often repeated and continuing violations of international law demonstrate Israel to be far more belligerent than Iraq. Additionally, no critics of U.S. policy towards Israel are quoted in this article, although it would seem appropriate when the White House is calling this move a reaffirmation of the United States' quote, long-standing strategic partnership with Israel, unquote. Could it be that the Associated Press could not find a critic of the U.S.'s Israeli policy to consult? No, it couldn't be. Government critics can be found in even the most intellectually devoid, religiously dogmatic, and culturally backward patriotic cities in America, and the cast, crew, and regular viewers of Days of Our Lives are living proof of that. Having this much good press in the United States is a nice day's work for the racist apartheid state of Israel, though not a surprising day's work. The fact remains that if government or corporations consider something a threat, it is received and reported by the corporate media with the appropriate hysteria. But if that person or country is a friend of the elite, such as Israel, it can kill and invade without reproach. Congratulations once again to the Grand Rapids Press for printing a politically biased and factually inadequate piece of propaganda. And now we move to our interview with our co-host, Teofilo Reyes. So, Tef, I'd like to talk a little bit about the trip that you've been on, but first I'd like to start out with this. Now, this was from an article in the Grand Rapids Press last week from the moralist and sort of our supreme leader of moral values, Cal Thomas. This article is titled, Christopher Columbus, Politically Incorrect, using that great watchword of the right here in this country these days. And Thomas, I'll just read a few things in this, and you can tell me what you think of this, given your experience. First of all, he refers to people who consider the celebrations of Columbus Day as ridiculous. He calls them crazies. And he says, quote, it should have been a good year for commemorating the accomplishments of Columbus 500 years ago, but historical revisionists have applied their political correctness standard to this great explorer and portrayed him as an intruder and disturber of a supposedly tranquil people who lived in harmony with nature and each other prior to the, quote, invasion, unquote. He also says, Columbus was a devout Christian who saw himself as God's instrument in the fulfillment of biblical prophecy to take the Christian gospel of redemption to new lands in every corner of the earth. He was also a scholar, fluent in Latin and knowledgeable enough in Greek and Hebrew to be able to read the Bible in its original languages. Now, can you comment on this at all? Or?
In that article, he mentions Columbus's log, Columbus's own diary, and talks about how he's such a, how his fervent Christianity, his Christian moral values, but he never mentions, like, in the parts of the diary where Columbus talks about how it'd be so easy to go in and subjugate and enslave the indigenous people he met. He never mentions how Columbus himself described the native people he met as being kind and generous and knowing nothing of weapons or war. So, like, therein where Cal Thomas is dissing on people for upholding Native American traditions, he doesn't have a ground to stand on, you know.
So in other words, we're not revisionists after all. It's basically like...
Well, they're the revisionists, if you see it. Interesting what he's talking about, the crazies. If throughout the country a lot of great things have happened, like the canceling of various protests on various parades because of protests, and a lot of curriculums that have been refurbished, and a lot of great things going on as a result of grassroots organizing. But
Thomas goes on to talk, and this is sort of what's been held up by the pro-Columbus people this year, about human sacrifices, ritual cannibalism, slavery, sacrificing of virgins, all that kind of stuff, and, you know, it's attributed to the Aztecs, which is what we always hear about. Can you give a little background about, you know, what was the state of Native America before it was called America, when Columbus arrived?
Well, those things that are mentioned are limited to certain areas, such as the Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire. certain elements in our society won't allow it.
Those elements which we try to expose every week here. Having said that, then, I talked a little bit on the last show, or 2 shows ago, about what was this march that we were on in Guatemala, but that you specifically started in Brownsville, Texas, and went all the way to Washington, D.C. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What was the purpose of it?
Right. Well, the march started in Panama on December 20th, 1991, which was the 2nd anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Panama, and it arrived in Washington, D.C. for the quincentennial celebration of Columbus's discovery. It was basically to expose the myths about Columbus, to bring to light the fact that there have been 500 years of imperialism, colonialism, slavery, and that it's definitely something that should not be celebrated. To celebrate Columbus is to celebrate the genocide of indigenous people, is to celebrate the millions of slaves that were brought over, is to, celebrate a lot of terrible things.
Okay, well, and most of our regular viewers should know that about Central and Latin America by now, about the history and legacy of colonialism, imperialism, and exploitation. But a lot of people in this country basically don't see that in this country. They think, since civil rights and everything, everyone's basically has equality of opportunity and everything else. But can you talk a little bit about the South and what you saw there?
Well, more than the South, just the entire continental U.S., dealing with any specific group of people, let's say Native Americans, there's one of the things we focused in on the walk was the fact that Columbus wasn't a thing of the past, but that the legacy was something that continued in the present and was could be seen in several things that are going on today. The Havasupai people are a native nation in the Grand Canyon who are having a lot of the sacred land threatened by uranium mining. There's a drive right now to get their land, take their land away from them so they can have all these wonderful uranium mines, but that would basically destroy their cultures. There are a lot of every single treaty the U.S. has ever gone into with Native nations has been broken, and
which is a violation of
constitutional law and international law as well. But recently, the Supreme Court legalized a case, basically legalized the breaking of the treaties, which so now there's a move to make a constitutional amendment so that the treaties are respected constitutionally. But obviously, we'd never hear anything about that. So,
right.
But in the South, we walked through Mississippi, and which is most of the places we stayed at were African American churches, and the poverty we saw was incredible. But there was like vote fraud in several towns we went through. We went through the poorest town, Tunica, Mississippi, which was one of the 2 poorest towns in the United States, and yet it has 36 millionaires. It's like being back in Central America.
That money should be trickling down, though, right? I mean, isn't that the way it works?
Well, maybe in a few thousand years, I don't know.
Okay.
But I remember we stopped at one time when we were walking. We walked about 20 miles a day, but we stopped for a break at this woman's shack, and her house was completely surrounded by cotton fields, and there were these planes that would fly over and drop pesticides. And whenever that would happen, she'd have to run out to bring her clothes off the line, otherwise they would get riddled with holes. So obviously her health couldn't be in great shape, but she had no choice but to be there.
Mm-hmm. Well, bringing up that point then, what's the state of the ecological imperialism that Columbus brought to this country? The kind of way that the natural environment was rearranged and obviously raped as it's being done today, and I mean, bringing up the idea of pesticides and everything else.
Yeah, mostly. Well, the only place we saw a lot of pesticide use was when we were through Mississippi, because all we saw were cotton fields. The other places we saw a little more diversity, except in northern Texas, all there was pine trees. It was a monoculture of pine trees. All the original hardwoods and different types of woods had been totally leveled down, and pine trees had been grown. And about every 2 minutes, a truck would go by loaded with trees that had just recently been cut. Over a period of 2 days, we had to stay at the same church, so we had to be transported back to the church. And in front of the church was this area that was, in front of it was trees, really thick, thick growth of trees. And we came back that night, and they were all gone. The rate of depletion is incredible. But one thing I want to mention is when we were walking through Tennessee, we saw a lot of poor whites, a lot of, I guess they call them hillbillies there because the poor always get named bad names or whatever. But one guy told us how he made less than $3 an hour where he worked. So the economy definitely is not in good shape.
So it affects everyone from 1492 on.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks for sharing that with us, Teff. Now it's time for you to go back to work. Start us off with a shortcut.
All right, I guess it's shortcuts now, and I'll start with kind of a sour note. We've all heard a lot of talk about ozone layer depletion, but very little talk about how grave the problem really is. Recently, scientists have found that the hole is 4 times the size of the United States, and it's still rapidly growing. From August until December, the hole gapes directly above the Mapuche nation that lives in, ironically enough, Tierra del Fuego. One Mapuche Indian, Walter Ulo,